Keeping with that, we're thinking local as well as global. And we're starting local. And we're starting with decarbonization at home. And we know that the backbone of decarbonization is energy. And where are we going to get the energy that we need to electrify the future in a way that supports a decarbonized economy? And so that's why we're starting with the biggest energy provider, or one of the biggest energy providers in the province. I know we got Fortis here too, but BC Hydro. And Anthea Jubb, thank you so much for joining us to speak to the the energy forecast. And so Anthea is not just going to talk about the next plan specifically, but rather looking into the future. And she's really interested in questions, and she's got all the capacity to answer them. And after Anthony, we're going to have another speaker, and we may just blend the two, Mark Zacharias, who I'll introduce in a minute. Anthea, come on up, and we'll look forward to your presentation. Thank you. And don't worry about the fact that we're a little bit behind. Doesn't matter. Okay, well, Mark may go after the break. All right, Anthea.
Thanks very much. I'm really happy to be here today and talk about long-term load forecasting and the possible futures for BC and the BC Hydro Service Territory. I'm the Acting Director of Energy Planning, and in that role I have responsibility for BC Hydro's Integrated Resource Plan. I've also just recently come from my base role, which is the Senior Manager Long-Term Load Forecasting, where my team's responsible for developing the long-term load forecasts. And that's a very interesting role, and it allows us to have insights to what's going on across the province. One of the ways to be a good forecaster is to hear perspectives and information from across all different points of view. So I'm really interested in hearing from you here today, and those of you online. What do you think the future holds? If you see something in our forecast and you're like, I don't agree with that, please let me know, please speak up, because that's how we get a better forecast. So to advance the slides, okay, great, thank you. So I'll set a little bit of context in terms of these load forecasts and how they fit in. And then I'm gonna get quickly into what we're seeing as the factors that are influencing load, both the historic trends and going forward. By way of context, the load forecast scenarios I'm going to talk about today were developed for our 2025 Integrated Resource Plan. That's a long-term plan that looks out to 2050 and considers how changes to electricity demand could occur over time and how we might address those changes with new electricity supply. Although it's a long-term plan going out to 2050, its actions focus really just on the first 5 years or so, and that's why they're called near-term actions. So you'll see the focus on the things that we're initiating or preparing for over the near term, and obviously we're going to have to do more actions over the longer term, and for that reason, we have an evergreen planning cycle. So the next plan, we've committed to doing it in 2028, and it'll have near-term actions for the subsequent 5 years. This plan is in front of our regulator, the BC Utilities Commission. It's undergoing a public proceeding right now. Anybody who's interested in participating in that proceeding, there's a lot of different ways to participate. Some of you will already be familiar with that. If you're not and you want to get involved, the BC Utilities Commission has information on how to participate. Most of you probably know this, but just for context setting, we are interested in long-term planning in two dimensions of electricity. There's energy, which is how much electricity is used over a period of time. And for the long-term resource plan, the units we use are gigawatt hours per year. On your bill, you would see that as kilowatt hours per month, most likely. And we also care about peak demand. Peak demand is the maximum power that our customers want in the 1 hour, the highest 1 hour of the year. And we care about that because we also have to have sufficient electrical capacity. So our long-term plan is interested both in capacity, being able to deliver power at the highest amount that our customers want at that peak demand, and also having enough energy. So you'll see both units, megawatts, peak demand, and energy in our forecasts. This slide just provides an overview of how we build our load forecasts at BC Hydro. Some of you will be familiar or will have worked with economy energy models that look at more of a top-down economic view. Our forecasts at BC Hydro aren't done that way. They are bottom-up, sector by sector, or in the case of the large industrial customers, customer by customer. Each individual existing customer is examined for the risk of, say, closure or expansion, and each proposal to take service from BC Hydro, so any new potential customer, is examined to understand what's the probability that they'll reach operations and by when. And we use a whole range of insights to develop that forecast. We obviously hear directly from our customers and the proponents. That's a really important source of information. And we also retain market experts. An example of a market expert that we use on residential, for example, is Conference Board of Canada, and they give us an independent forecast of the economic outlook at the sub-regional level in BC. So for example, Richmond or Burnaby or the northeast or northwest. So those are some of the inputs that we use. But even with all of the expert inputs and the best method, nobody can really tell the future, right? That's undeniably true. So for that reason, we use load scenarios. I'll start by just describing the reference forecast. The reference forecast uses methods that have been tested and refined really over decades and subject to extensive scrutiny and refinement. And this is the load forecast that we expect to be reasonably accurate over the next, say, 5 to 7 years. We benchmark it for accuracy every month. Pretty much every utility in North America has an every electric utility would have a load forecasting department. And we publish our forecast accuracy, and we compare how our forecast compares to our peers. And we're looking for a good accuracy would be around 2%. We want to be within 2% over the 5 to 7 year time frame, and we have achieved that in the last number of years. So that's something I'm really proud of. But with all honesty, once you get out certainly past 10 years, we don't know what the future holds, and we're kidding ourselves if we think we do. So to address that uncertainty, we use load scenarios. We consider a low load scenario where load growth is lower than our reference, and also the possibility of higher load growth. We call that the high load scenario. And then we're also sometimes interested in a specific region. And one region that we're very interested in is the North Coast. That's an important region for BC Hydro because, first of all, it's transmission constrained, as many of you know. There's a limited amount of power that we can get into that region right now. And secondly, it's a region with really the highest potential for load growth and economic and industrial development in our province. Is the region with a lot of the nation building projects identified by both our Prime Minister and previously the priority projects identified by the Premier. So there's a lot of potential in that region and a lot of uncertainty. So we've also got a North Coast specific scenario that I'll run through. Okay, I'm happy to take questions as we go.
Okay. I have one. You need to use the mic. Oh, yeah. Check. So what is the impact? You mentioned transmission loss in there. And I was just wondering, what is the impact of your efforts to improve transmission loss? I'm sure there's some thought put to that. How do we reduce the loss, or is that just going to be a constant in terms of energy growth? Because one of the ways you could grow your energy supply is by reducing transmission loss.
Are you referring to the technical losses over transmission line?
Yes.
Oh, I see. Yeah, so we do have we have a transmission planning group, and they have a range of measures that they can get more capacity out of an existing transmission line. And there's efforts underway in the North Coast, for example. We've got the Prince George to Terrace Capacitor project, and that project can increase the capacity of a transmission line without needing to lay entirely new wires. So we certainly prioritize those opportunities where they exist because they're generally lower cost and they have less impact to the land than laying entirely new wires. At a certain point, though, once you've tapped those out, and we are seeing that in the North Coast region, there at some point there's a need for a second line and a twinning of the line. But absolutely, if you can get more out of your existing assets, that's got to come first. That's not just the case for transmission, that's also the case for our generation assets. So our long-term resource plan has, for example, adding a 6th turbine at our Revelstoke generating facility. It's always going to be more cost effective and have less impact on the land and water if you optimize your existing assets first. Okay, back to load. Yes, go ahead. Can you say that again?
Oh, sorry. No, I was just curious what your current energy mix is in terms of generation or capacity.
It is. Now this is by memory, so don't quote me. And we do publish those types of statistics. Definitely the vast majority is hydro, our own reservoir storage hydro, and also independent power producers. I believe that's well over 90% right now. As people would know, we are bringing in really a vast amount of wind through the 2024 call for power and the 2025, and there's potential for even more. So those two calls together may bring in a significant amount of wind, but we're not expecting that to come into. It takes time to develop those projects, so those are coming in the near future. Okay, so back to load, which is one of my favorite topics. Supply is important too, but load is very interesting as well. So I've just got a couple slides here that demonstrate some of the factors that are influencing load. And I think they're kind of provocative. So the first one is the economic outlook. And this is from Conference Board of Canada, an independent expert. And that's the bar chart. And what you can see from their outlook is that housing starts are declining. The rate of growth of housing starts is declining. And that impacts on the residential side, the formation of new residential counts and residential growth. They also expect population growth to moderate. So those are some factors that are really moderating residential growth relative to what you might expect, because we see buildings going up all over the place. And the other thing that is profound and long-lasting and a good news story is the effect of energy efficiency on how much electricity buildings need. The line chart here on the left shows, we call this the electricity use intensity, is the amount of electricity per square meter or square foot of buildings. It's looking at all commercial buildings, so not just new buildings, which we know are more efficient, but existing ones as well. And that intensity has dropped by 30% over the last 20 years. That means that you could build 30% more commercial buildings and all else equal, you wouldn't need any more electricity. So these are profound trends that are offsetting growth that you might otherwise expect from things like electrification of heating or electric vehicles. And now industry, which is really an interesting place. It's where my background is. I started my career in heavy industry. There's a lot of potential and a lot of uncertainty in large industry in BC. I've got a couple visuals here to illustrate that. The bar chart, these are actual, well, in some cases expected prices of delivered LNG to Japan, which is one of our major markets for LNG, and you've got 4 actual BC projects either proposed. At this time, they're proposed. They're not quite underway, but their costs are well understood. And those are the solid bars. Those are the BC projects. The grayed out bars, those are our biggest competition. Those are LNG projects out of the US Gulf Coast. So you can see the delivered cost is pretty tight between us and the US Gulf Coast. It's a competition to get those customers in East Asia. Whether we'll win that competition remains to be seen, but we're at least competitive. Like, we're in the mix, our BC LNG, but we're not a clear winner. Like, if you look at the price differential, it's pretty close, right? Lots of competition for those business opportunities. And then the line chart there shows a similar story with mining. Mining's another area of really large potential growth for BC. We have vast mineral reserves in BC. And how to read this line chart is existing copper production across North America is shown there. Canada is blue, and BC is almost half of the Canada line. But as you can see, Mexico and US, they're bigger than us. They've also got vast copper reserves and a lot of production. That green mountain, that's the opportunity across all of North America. We have a chance to get some of that opportunity, but US and Mexico are going after that same opportunity. They also have copper reserves, and they're also chasing that opportunity. So who's going to get those market opportunities? That remains to be seen. One thing that BC Hydro can do to help set the stage and enable growth, of course, is to have electricity supply. So all else equal, having reliable electricity supply is going to make a proposed mine development just more promising. There's lots of other hurdles it's got to get through, but certainly if there's no electricity, that's going to be a downside for that development. And I have another kind of interesting chart here that just talks about how things have changed in BC and highlights what I alluded to before, which is, yes, there's a lot of things pushing load up, but there's other things dragging it down. And some of them are good things like energy efficiency, and some of them are just structural changes in our economy. This chart shows BC Hydro's large industrial energy sales, historic and forecast, going back to 2005. And the green is the forestry industry. That used to be by far our largest industrial segment. We had the largest sales to that group, and you can see a dramatic decline. And some of you will have seen that the Crofton Pulp Mill announced permanent closure yesterday. The Crofton Pulp Mill used to be, even as recent as 2018, used to be one of BC Hydro's largest customers. So when you have large customers like that closing down, it takes a lot of heat pumps to make up for that load loss. So it's just to be aware of the changing dynamic and some of the offsetting effects that are impacting load. There's other industrial opportunity in BC, and some of that's filling the gap from forestry. So we've got mining, as I mentioned. There's a lot of potential for mines in BC, particularly in that North Coast region. Oil and gas and LNG, we've seen a lot of electrification of oil and gas and LNG, and I was really glad to hear about the continued support for industrial carbon pricing, because that is one of the drivers for the electrification of that sector. And then that other part it's not as big as oil and gas and LNG and mining, but it's strategically and critically important because it includes things like ports. And as an example, the Port of Prince Rupert, we know that's a critical project of strategic interest to BC and Canada. And ports are an important part of our potential economic prosperity. Any questions on that before I get into the results or comments?
Yeah, I love that slide that you were talking
This
about.
one?
No, the one that you really liked. Yeah, that one there.
Industry.
So you were mentioning is that if there was efficiency, cars are getting more efficient, buildings are more efficient, right? And so that's dropping the demand, right? And it's allowing that demand to shift, and it's also allowing us not to have to build more dams, because you can imagine, dams and power, even windmills. It's a big impact on the land, and so as a representative of the First Nations here, we're concerned about how can we achieve our targets without disturbing as much land. So being more efficient is probably a huge pool of energy there that you can draw on. And I was wondering, when in your slides, what you've got there is, we're looking for, as the pulp mill disappears, we're looking for another massive client, which is copper, which is good. We need the copper. And I'm just wondering do you do analysis on how much of that energy for copper is going to come from efficiency and how much is going to come from building and disturbing lands?
There are opportunities for energy efficiency in heavy industry. New industry, though, generally is fairly efficient. Where we're still seeing dramatic opportunities for energy efficiency, and energy efficiency comes first in our integrated resource plan. It is BC Hydro's first resource, both in our legal framework and also it's our long-standing practice that we pursue cost-effective energy efficiency before physical build-outs. Our energy efficiency plan is thousands of gigawatt hours. It's as much as the calls for power. On the capacity-focused DSM side, our energy efficiency plan is almost 800 megawatts. So it's a very ambitious plan, and it certainly comes first. Where we're seeing major opportunities for energy efficiency, certainly in buildings, and a good example is converting from baseboard to heat pump. If you're in a temperate climate, such as the southern Vancouver Island, you can get savings of 2/3 by doing that, and electricity savings. There's also continued opportunities for lighting, particularly in the commercial sector. Then there's lots of opportunities for load shifting type technologies such as time varying rates. And on the industrial side, opportunities for what we call load curtailment or critical peak pricing to encourage customers to shift when they use electricity to another time of day.
What about infrastructure? Like, if you build, is new infrastructure more efficient than the old infrastructure?
That should generally be true because we have had changes to energy product standards and energy efficiency product standards. So that should generally be true. But I think with efficiency, like we can't give up and just assume it's going to continue. Like we always have to push it and promote it because sometimes the less efficient choice is cheaper. And coming back to the example of baseboards, like it's cheaper to install a baseboard than a heat pump, at least the upfront cost. But over the long term, it's better for everybody if we go with the heat pump. So we can't just lose track of the need to continue to push and encourage energy efficiency. It is the best resource in terms of land and water impacts and also customer bills. I'll just run through the results. I don't want to go late. Alex will tell me when to stop talking. And maybe tell some of the stories behind the numbers. This is the highest level result, is the system energy forecast. The main story here really is just the blue line is our actual electricity sales since 2005, and it's been pretty flat. And it's not because we haven't had growth in some areas, we have, but we've had this offsetting effect of forestry industry closures and energy efficiency. The dashed lines are the load scenarios, and the middle one's the reference, and then we've got the higher and the lower. And I'll just move to some of the stories behind those numbers that are maybe the more interesting one. So the oil and gas analogy is pretty interesting. You can see going back to 2005, there was almost no electricity load to this sector. We've had rapid growth rapid electrification in this sector, driven a lot by things like the output-based pricing. And we are expecting that to continue. In every load scenario, we have steep growth going out to 2030. We know we have LNG projects coming into service. We've got other ones that are still uncertain, but each LNG proposal in the province, each one is considered in our load scenarios. The ones that are still at the earlier stage of development, they might be risk adjusted to reflect the probability of coming into service. But I can assure you, there's no LNG terminal proposal in BC that we haven't considered in these load scenarios. One thing to be aware of, though, in terms of how this is done, is we don't include projects that we don't know enough about to have a location, a proponent, and an estimate of electrical requirements. So there's no kind of proxy projects in here. So you wouldn't see things like this proposed oil pipeline to the coast in here, because we don't have a proponent, we don't have a location, we don't have an electrical service request. But any project that's gotten at least as far as to talk to BC Hydro and say, this is who I am, I think I need so many megawatts, this is where I want to locate, is being considered. Why is it flat after 2035? It's pretty odd to see it flatten out, because it's not that there's not more potential after that point. It's just that that's as far out as our visibility goes to new projects. Mining? Yes, please go ahead.
Look at you. Oh, there we go. Thank you. Just wanted to ask you about when you're talking about the proxies and the things that you build within the forecast, are you including only items that are at a SIS level, like the system impact study, or do you go prior to that? Like, do you include projects that you've just heard about and people are talking to you, or is it just the SIS and SIS included?
For those of you who might not be familiar with that term, maybe everybody is, but for those of you who might not, the system impact study, that is a stage of BC Hydro's interconnections process, and it's a stage at which a customer or a proposed new load, proposed customer, to reach that stage, they have started to invest some money into the project. So it's more than just a concept. They've started to put money up, and we've started to do some engineering work. And there's subsequent stages after that where the project gets more real or further progressed. So for the reference scenario, we generally consider system impact as a benchmark to be considered in the reference scenario. We look at other things like the status of permits. Do they have their environmental assessment permit? Do they have customers yet for this project? Is there financing in place? Where are the interconnections queue? Do they have Indigenous agreements and partnerships in place? Are they facing lawsuits? So we look at all of those same things for every scenario, but for the high load scenario, it's a more generous view. So a project might get 50% under the reference, 50% risk adjustment, maybe it's only 25% under the high. So it's the same information, it's just a different threshold of risk. And system impact study absolutely is an important criteria for the reference in particular. But for the high load scenario, we have projects that are not yet at that stage. Mining is also an area of a lot of growth. Mining, there's relative to oil and gas and LNG, where you've got many individual stages of projects. Mining, they're large and lumpy loads. So that's why you see these step changes in the forecast. There's also a possibility that we won't be successful in seizing those opportunities, and we'll have mine closures. And that's the low load scenario here. Forestry, we've talked a bit about this, and we heard even more about it yesterday with Crofton closing down. It's just been a really dramatic drop in load, almost 10,000 gigawatt hours. We only had sales of 50,000 back in 2005, so really dramatic change there, and we're not expecting that industry to bounce back. I mean, anything's possible, but based on the expert input that we're seeing now, we're not seeing a bounce back.
I've got a question about
Okay.
that.
This we'll do this one more question, and then we'll let Anthea come to
Okay.
the punchline of her presentation,
Okay.
and we'll take a break.
Okay.
We'll hear from Mark, and we'll have. There's lots more questions, and the questions will apply to both of them. Okay, go ahead.
Okay, I'll make this short. At some of these industrial sites where the forestry operations are shutting down, there are data centers being built. IREN, for example, has built 3 data centers at where forestry operations shut down, mainly because there's a lot of electrical infrastructure already there. So at a location like Crofton, there's actually the potential for that to be replaced with a data center or other industrial application. And so how is that factored into your load forecast? I know the closure was announced yesterday, so maybe you're not on it yet, but do you want to comment on that?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, we do obviously encourage redevelopment of those sites and use of the industrial assets. That's good for the local economy as well. With all of our industrial load forecast approach, whether it's data centers or any other type of customer, we would need a proponent to come in and say, I'm going to redevelop this site. This is what I'm going to do. This is how much electricity I'm expecting to use. So that could have happened at Crofton. I don't know, but that's what we look for. And we have some of the other sites definitely have had proponents come in. I mean, wood fiber is a great example, right? Wood fiber is a pulp mill I worked at in my early career, and then it closed. It's been closed for a long time, and now it's being redeveloped. So it as an LNG terminal. So it certainly can happen, and we're looking for those serious proposals with a proponent behind them and a specific proposal. Okay, I'm not going to talk about electric vehicles. I want to end on the North Coast because that's an area of... I can come back to electric vehicles if people want, but I know I'm at time and I wanted to cover the North Coast at least before wrapping up. So we did a specific regional load forecast just looking at the North Coast region, that opportunity. And you can see that load in the North Coast, it's been flat for a long time. And that's because we've had some major closures up there. We've had pulp mills and chemical plants up there close. This is also the region with a lot of potential. We've got these nation building projects up there. We've got a lot of interest in developing that region. We've got the Port of Prince Rupert. So we did examine a range of load scenarios up there. The dashed blue is the reference. So that's using that framework of how far along are these projects? Do they have permits? Have they advanced through our interconnections? And then the higher gray dashed line, that is a North Coast sensitivity considering actual project proposals, all of them, that have progressed through at least some level of milestones, such as having a permit, Indigenous agreements, entering the interconnections queue. And this is a trajectory of how load could develop to a point where the proposed new North Coast transmission line is fully subscribed on a firm service basis. So as I said, lots of potential. If that happens, that would be more than a tripling of load in that region, but that is a potential that BC government, federal government, and many of us are looking to seize. That I think I'm at time.
Okay, is that your last slide?
I think that's enough. Yeah. If someone has a question about electric vehicles or other stuff, we can bounce around.
I think one of
but-
the questions on people's minds is when you put all of that together, what's the load forecast we're imagining 20 years from now?
And that's this slide, which I really glossed over. So yes, I didn't spend long on it at all, but this is the long-term load forecast scenarios. The three, the reference, the low, and the high. And you can see in the reference, we've got about 1.5% compound average annual growth. The low looks kind of like history, where you've got all of these downward forces, energy efficiency, industrial closures, offsetting growth. The reference does include electrification. It does include zero carbon building code as an example, electric vehicles. And then the high really, it has all of that stuff, that electrification effort, and more industrial development. So more mines, more upstream oil and gas electrification. So those are the load projections that we're using in the 2025 IRP. Every year we issue a new set of forecasts because things change all the time. So this is the outlook for the 2025 IRP. When we file our next integrated resource plan in 2028, well, we'll see how this changes.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much, Anthea. We're going to hear from Mark Zacharias, who is with the Clean Energy Canada. And Mark is testimony, as are a couple other people in the room, to deputy ministers retire, but they don't quit, which is a good thing, because after working so hard trying to reconcile almost irreconcilable things, you learn, and we don't want to lose that skill set just because you stop working in the public service. And Mark and Dave, you'll hear from later, our testimony that they still got the juice to carry on. And thank you for that, Mark. And look forward to hearing your remarks right now. And then we'll field questions and comments, and both Mark and Anthea will endeavor to respond to them. Okay, so thanks very much. Over to you, Mark.
All right. Do you want me to, I can use the lectern if that's easier, or I can just do it from here. I have been directed to the lectern. I will use the lectern. All right. Thanks very much. I'm Mark Zacharias. I'm with Clean Energy Canada. We are a Canadian national climate and clean energy think tank. We have offices across Canada. We do work on all elements of energy policy. And I have 3 slides today because I wanted to leave a whole bunch of time for questions, because I think the IRP is tremendously important, particularly for everybody in the room and online. And if you're expecting some spicy rebuttal to Anthea's presentation, you're going to be sorely disappointed. We have what we would say are some questions around the IRP and some friendly amendments. And I'm just going to go through these very quickly at a very high level, and then we can jump into some of the details. Okay. So, very quickly, the way we look at this integrated resource plan, and we read all of them in great detail. This one is short. It's only 413 pages. The last one was over 1,000 pages. They're highly, highly detailed and hard to understand. It takes a long time. But we've seen actually a lot of progress in this one, and there's a lot of things to like. The way we've put it in an op-ed that we published last week in Business in Vancouver is, it's the right recipe, but maybe the wrong proportions. And I'll get to kind of why that is so in a minute here. I'm not going to read my slides. You can have a look at these, but I want you to keep in mind there's a couple of these that are absolutely critical as we move forward. One is the recognition, probably for the first time in an IRP, that oversupply is preferable to undersupply. What we're seeing all around the world right now is utilities, crown, private, governments, those that have actually overbuilt their electricity systems are benefiting because they have off-takers in a whole range of different industries and sectors. Those that have underbuilt are having to, A, stand up new power sources really quickly and try and buy a gas turbine these days in the global market, or B, they're having to import power from somewhere else. So keep that in mind, because that's, I think, a very important constraint moving forward here. I really like the IRP. It was honest about how uncertain the world is around us. Linda said that this morning. I think that's a very germane piece of this. And the third piece that I really liked about the IRP is actually gives agency to the customers. We've always been customers to our utilities where it's a one-way transaction. They give us power, we pay a bill. We actually now have a system where we are going to be able to produce power, store it in home batteries, use your EVs to actually power your home. So there's a new way of thinking coming around here, and it is really promising and really nice to see hydro kind of seizing this fully. So that's kind of on the get right. Now, My next line here, and I may fail epically on this, what I've tried to do is take a 413-page IRP and put it in one slide here. So how this works is hydro has 5 different buckets of ways they're going to build capacity. This is build supply to meet 2030 and 2035. And those buckets broadly are energy purchase agreement renewals. So these are existing agreements, and many of you in this room and online will be participating on this. That adds about 24% of the new power needs by 2030. This is under the reference scenario that Anthea talked about. That is energy purchase agreements. These are the renewals. The 2 new calls for power, the one that was in December of last year, so that adds about 26% of the new power that's going to be needed and it's going to be supplied under the reference scenario by 2030. The second call for power that's just happened this year, that'll come on into the 2035 range. Additional energy acquisitions is kind of a broad bucket that hydro uses. This could be going to the private sector. This could actually be going to their own self-generation. It could be imports, but about 20% of the new power in the next kind of 5 years. And Anthea talked about efficiency programs as being a huge part of hydro. And if you actually look at the percentage of the power needs that are going to be met through efficiency, it's quite large. And then community and solar. Now, there's one kind of key thing on here that actually ties back to the over and under supply that keep in mind here. So this is the reference scenario. So this is the scenario that hydro thinks is actually going to happen, to the most likely in their scenarios. And you can see the way they've set it up is that there's a very small surplus in 2030 of about 3% supply over what they thought would be this in the reference scenario, and that grows to about 5%. So, from our perspective in a think tank, and we look at the integrated resource plans of pretty much every jurisdiction around the world that has them, it's running it pretty close to the line. It's still reasonable, but just something to keep in mind. And then final slide here is, what are some of the uncertainties around kind of any integrated planning? And this is not specific to BC Hydro. This is specific to any Crown or private utility in Canada or elsewhere. The first one, I think we're all aware of it. The pace and scale of global electrification is just unbelievable. This year alone, there's US $3.3 trillion of investment in energy. That's across the globe. Of that $3.3 trillion, $2.1 trillion is in the clean side. So it is in clean energy infrastructure and clean energy technologies. So this is an incredible global shift that's happened over the last 5 years. So just keeping that in mind as we are seeing the uptake of clean technologies and clean electricity. It's faster than anything anyone's ever seen before. The second one we've already talked about. We have a premier who uses the phrase clean energy superpower. And we have a prime minister that's rolling out every couple of months these 5 new buckets of 5 projects of national interest. All of these have actually load growth attached to this. Now, BC Hydro is quite right, is that until these things become real with the proponent or real with the regulation, they don't build them into their forecasting. Now, however, if you look at pretty much any government right now, you're realizing that these projects are becoming more and more real. We are actually going to start, even though we may not have a proponent, we need to start thinking about building that load and forecasting that load because we will have one. And I'll just give you a very quick example. Monday, I was in front of the House of Commons Committee on the Economic Growth Council. This was set up by the leader of the opposition, Pierre Poilievre. Spent almost an hour with the group. And a bunch of Conservative MPs are all, yes, electricity will be the main vector in the Canadian economy in the decades ahead. We need to plan for that. Third one to kind of be aware of is, it used to be that electricity could easily be moved between jurisdictions, and that's happening right now. We have massive solar overproduction during the day and during April and May in the Southwest US. That can be bought by BC Hydro and other utilities exceedingly cheaply, like very, very low rates. And in turn, we hold water back in our hydro dams. And that curve, it's called the duck curve because there's solar overproduction in the day and wind production in the evening. California and the Southwest US, they're actually learning how to seize that. So they're not going to have a huge amount of energy during the day to actually send out. So we need to kind of start thinking about as a jurisdiction around, the idea that we can always depend on imports maybe coming to an end. The other ones too, we do look at the IRP. It is by nature a conservative plan because it is done for the BCUC, the regulator, under very, very strict ways they can actually do their planning. But it does assume that BC is not going to meet its climate targets. And to be in truth, BC isn't going to meet its climate targets, at least not right now. But future governments and future technologies may mean that we get back on track with climate action and more electricity is going to be required. Population growth, BC is a desirable place to live, particularly in an uncertain world. And we have seen some short-term population immigration drop off in the last kind of year or so, particularly with the federal government kind of putting caps on immigration. BC is still going to be a place that people want to live in the coming decades. And then lastly, too, is just in terms of economic growth, we think BC's economy has much more upside than probably the IRP forecasts. And I know it's based on Conference Board of Canada, but we are pretty bullish on kind of what our jurisdiction is going to look like, and therefore it's going to need more power. The last thing I want to say here before I turn it over for questions is the BC government in the last year has said that there would be periodic calls for power. They've kind of suggested that every 2 years that BC Hydro would go to the market and secure more power from private proponents, which obviously has benefits for Indigenous nations that are participating in this. The IRP doesn't have anything past the call for power that has just happened this year. We think that sets us up into a situation which might look a little bit like 2017, where the standing offer program was ended. And we had a lot of companies that were looking at BC to invest in, and they kind of walked away. And only now they've started to come back. So we would like to see the IRP have some frequent calendarized call for power. And really, that's very quickly just kind of some thoughts on the IRP. But again, I just want to iterate, there's a lot to like in it, and these would be friendly amendments from our perspective. How did I do?
Okay. Well, I'm going to kick off with a question, actually two. An appeal, the first question is just an appeal that when you answer the questions to come, you simplify a little bit. Gigawatt hours, even megawatts, doesn't necessarily resonate for people. And your article in Business in Vancouver, you talked about Site C equivalence, which is quite helpful because we've all experienced that. We all know what it is, even if we haven't seen it. And everybody's wondering, and this is leading to my second question, or my question, which is, everybody's wondering, how much do we need? And I have to say, the presentation that you gave, Anthea, gave me a sense that, maybe not too much. But then I think about Linda's presentation and the disruption that's coming from so many different angles, and the federal government's ambition, which is a reflection of the circumstances the country finds itself in, which is pretty significant and dire, is to develop our way out of a difficult situation. And we've got a bunch of projects on the table that are nationally significant, some of which I think are reflected in what you showed. But there's more to come, as you just pointed out, Mark. And so the political commitment point in your slides, Mark, is a fairly important one. If our ambitions are to build things, to military bases in the north, all the projects that are on the list, plus more projects to come, and we're not investing in the energy required to make those projects real, then where does that put us? That's the first question. And what do we need to do when, this is the second question, we can't expect the ratepayers of BC Hydro to assume all the risks associated with building the energy before it's necessarily needed, which is your point about oversupply is a good thing. It's not a good thing if you're the person that's paying the bill and it might not be needed. So I want you to reflect on the extent to which the federal government is stepping up sufficiently, and the provincial government, to help to proactively build the infrastructure that we need, And how much infrastructure do we actually need if we actually build for what our ambitions are? Thanks.
Testing. Okay, it's a good question. We look at electricity in today's economy globally as a no regrets action. And that if you overbuild, there will be a customer somewhere and you'll be able to amortize the cost of that generation and the transmission to wherever it's going to need to go. And yes, there may be some costs on the taxpayer versus the ratepayer, but we're seeing that across all jurisdictions right now. So that's kind of the way we're sort of looking at electricity. Now, we're not saying that the reference scenario in the IRP is in any way deficient, but we are saying that, don't underbuild. Overbuild because there will be a market for it. And in Hydro's defense, it's not their job to actually build BC's economic future. It's government's job to tell them to build Canada's and BC's economic future. So that's the way I kind of look at it. So I understand why the IRP is situated the way it is. But I do think like our secret sauce, our competitive advantage is cheap electricity. Canada has, I don't know if you know this, but Canada has, in the G7, we have the cheapest electricity in the G7, and BC has the third cheapest electricity in North America after Manitoba and Quebec. We do a good job at this, and we should be leveraging this. This is our competitive strength.
We do have the third lowest rates in North America, and keeping costs down for our customers is a planning priority for BC Hydro. At the same time, we do need to build for our future and for the economic development to come. One of the ways that we can balance that is by having more frequent integrated resource plans. We are committed to coming back again in 2028 and considering the timing of new investments and new supply. Our integrated resource plan near-term action does call for preparation for additional energy acquisitions. You're right, it doesn't specify the specific timing, and we'll be looking at that timing when we come back in 2028.
Go ahead, Robert. There we go.
Thanks so much. Robert Johnson from University of Calgary. Great presentations. A couple of questions, if you'll indulge me. One is I'd love to hear more about imports from the U.S. Mark, you mentioned what's happening in the U.S. market there and some of the shifts. Seems like it used to be a north to south trade. Now it's becoming more south to north. But I'm curious how that shows up in the IRP. And the second question is, if we had this conversation, 5 years ago, we probably would have led with a discussion of electric vehicles and hydrogen and the electrification of the economy. Now we sort of led with the North Coast industrial development. So we didn't get to see your EV slide, but I'd love to hear, I would at least would like to hear a little bit about that and where some of those assumptions about decarbonization-based electricity demand growth are today versus a few years ago.
Yeah, I'd be happy to talk about the EV slide. And I'll just give you the highlights. I won't put it up. I think the deck was circulated if you want to take a look. So electric vehicles are projected to be pretty much the highest load growth area in our reference forecast. In our reference forecast, they reach 7,000 gigawatt hours over the planning horizon, which is more than Site C. That's on an energy basis. And there's been a lot of changes in the electric vehicle mandates and a lot of headwinds for that sector. We still believe that over the long term, electric vehicle adoption is going to continue. We've seen in other parts of the world, China and parts of Europe, that electric vehicles they're way ahead of us in electric vehicles, and you can get an affordable electric vehicle and they're mass market. The transit fleets are fully electrified in many parts of the world, delivery fleets. So there's definitely, we still believe the potential is there, and it's reflected in our reference forecast, but I'm not sure we got the timing right now. I mean, we've seen the mandates. We saw the federal one paused We saw the announcement from the provincial government and the Clean BC review saying, don't go for 100% sales over the near term. So electric vehicles, it might take longer to get relative to what we put in the reference forecast, but we do see them coming. I think those global market forces pushing electric vehicles, eventually they're going to be unstoppable. That's my view. There's probably still always a role for diesel and internal combustion, particularly in northern regions. But I think in an urban setting, I think it's just a matter of time.
Yeah, I would fully agree with that. And I do want to talk about imports and exports. There's been a lot of chatter in the media over the last 2 years around the amount of power that BC has had to import. And the rationale for that has been, at least in the media, is that we've been in a 3-year drought. That drought is now over, and that has caused BC to have more imports than exports. Ergo, and coming to the conclusion that our electricity system isn't up to task. So looking at absolute imports versus exports is not the right measure. The right measure is to look at the value of those imports. And if you actually look at the value of those imports, over the last number of years, since 2022, BC's made $1.5 billion off of electricity exports. And the reason for that, obviously, is we have large hydro reservoirs that act like batteries. So we can pull in power when it's cheap, almost free some days at some hours, into BC, use it there, hold back water till when power is expensive, and then we sell it out. I just pulled the numbers before this meeting. Site C came online, I think it was the second week of August. The first full month of BC's import-export picture is now in the books for September. And we sold $115 million of power outside of BC just in 1 month after Site C came on. So, keep that in mind. So from an economic development perspective, we treat hydro as this crown commercial utility that just keeps the lights on. But, we need really to think about it as like, this is part of the economic engine of BC, along with all of the private sector providers that are also going to contribute into the system. So it's an untold story here, but it's a good one.
And sorry, does the import, how does that factor in the IRP, the sort of expectation?
We are required for long-term planning to plan to self-sufficiency. That is a legal requirement for our integrated resource plans, which means you will not find imports as a resource in our integrated resource plan, and nor are we. There's a market allowance, but we need to plan to be self-sufficient. That's a long-standing policy in BC. The parameters around it have varied in terms of its stringency, but that is still in effect. And we do plan for self-sufficiency. We plan to have enough energy and capacity in BC. That's our requirement.
Good day. Hello. So, sitting here listening to this, and Mark, great to meet you, and thinking about born and raised in the forest industry in British Columbia, worked in the forest industry my whole life, and watching Crofton shut down this morning was horrible. And thinking about traveling from Cranbrook to Fort Nelson to all over British Columbia. And Ike Barber used to say that we were dying in a sea of green, and he was talking about cutting permits. Today we're burning in a sea of green. Like, you take a look from Fort Nelson to Cranbrook to Lac La Hache to all the places where we've had fires. And one of the things that I agree with that the point of BC Hydro should be to bring the cheapest power that you can. And you guys have done a good job of that because you've dammed a bunch of rivers, quite frankly. But it makes sense. Like, I like paying 5.5 cents a kilowatt hour at my industrial sites. I get that. That's really important. But what I don't see is anybody talking about biomass. I see wind. I see, and I think from both a First Nation perspective, who live in every one of those communities that I've talked about, they're all across British Columbia, but also from a public policy perspective, not necessarily the lowest price power, but certainly firm power compared to wind. And I don't understand why I don't hear more. And when I talk to some of the board members in BC Hydro, I hear, well, Brian, the problem is that we've had people shut down their plants. Well, if those plants weren't owned by corporations, but they were owned by, or the public policy existed to keep them running when the forest industry sucked like this last couple of years, I'm just curious what your thought is on that, Mark. Thank you.
Biomass power generation has a lot of attractive qualities about it. It's greenhouse gas emission neutral, it's firm, it results in local economic development. So broadly speaking, biomass it's an attractive resource for BC Hydro.
Yeah, I would agree, Brian. It's a good question. I always wondered what's holding it back, and just what are the factors? I have to kind of think more about it. And it's not just biomass. Geothermal is another opportunity. I'm just anecdotally hearing about geothermal opportunities in Northeast BC for 10 cents a kilowatt hour. If that's real, that's firm baseload power. Again, it just could be myth, but if it is real and it's actually achievable, that'd be a huge opportunity for us.
Okay, last question. Go ahead, Steve.
I was actually interested in the slide where you were talking about the recontracting, and it was 26% of the opportunity. Is that truly recontracting currently permitted sites, or is that just sweating assets that are kind of fully amortized and you can, in Ontario, where I come from, we're certainly seeing that. A 20-year PPA, you add 5 years because there's still some life left in the asset. But how is 26% was eye-catching to me. How's that all going to unpack itself? Is that being thought through? And sorry if that's way too technical. I didn't want to be the smoke bomb from that.
It's a really good question. I am not super familiar with kind of the amortization period of a lot of the existing IPPs that are being renewed right now. My understanding is a lot of them are run a river, so they do have many decade design life. So it actually makes a lot of sense to kind of recommission them and kind of re-up their contracts. And also too is, obviously when these were built, 10, 15 years ago, 20 years ago, their percents per kilowatt hour is quite high, but through the amortization of the life cycle, they're now able to participate in these clean power calls at a reasonable rate. And you probably know way more about this than I do.
I see. I hadn't appreciated that the jargon we use is IPP renewals. That's what the question's about. So those are, as I understand it, those are existing private power producers that have a long-term contract with BC Hydro. When those contracts expire, and they're all fixed term, we absolutely seek to renew them and extend them. That is always desirable if we can get, obviously the owner has to want to, so it's a two-way agreement, and sometimes they don't. Sometimes they want to do something else with that power. And then it has to be reasonable terms and prices, and it's subject to approval by our regulator. So all of those independent power, we call them electricity purchase agreements, go to the regulator. But absolutely, we seek to renew them where we can and where the owner will do so.
Yeah, and thank you for that. Mark, I think what you said tweaked with me because it's so much run of the river here in BC versus other jurisdictions. It's gas and it's wind, which have a finite life, and you got to repower the whole thing. Yeah, thank you for that.
Okay. Thank you very much. And we are going to have to move on.